All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon. I hope you all had a good week. And I'm certain that our speaker today is going to be a really nice capstone to that week. I want to thank Dr. Marc Stern of Virginia Tech for agreeing to speak with us this afternoon. And I'm going to let him take care of the remaining introductions. I'll remind everyone, if you would, to keep your machines on mute. But if you have a question or any sort of clarification, by all means, feel free to use the chat. When Marc is done, we'll have some time for discussion. And of course, we'll be able to use both cameras and mics at that time. So whenever you're ready, Marc, take it away.
All right, cool. I'm just trying to set up my screen here. Welcome, everyone. I would love, before we start, since we're a pretty small group, maybe I'll just ask everyone, as I'm looking at the Brady Bunch thing of faces here, if you can all click the rename so if you slide over your video and go to the three little dots, the ellipsis, and just share the organization after your name. So like I did, I just my name, comma, Virginia Tech. I'd love to know where y'all are from and just to get a sense of who's here. And as you're doing that, I suppose I'll ask one other question that you can think about, and then I'll introduce myself. So the other question is, so I'm a social scientist, and I'm curious about the biggest problems that you're facing and why you're interested in hearing from a social scientist who works in the human dimensions of natural resource management. So if you'd like to share some ideas in the chat about the biggest challenges you're facing, issues that have been problems for you, it'd be really cool for me just to get a general sense, or something you really wish I would talk about. I might be able to tweak things just a little bit to share examples that are more relevant in that way. So I'll give it a minute for everyone to do that. Thank you very much. See some folks from Chesapeake Bay. Yep. Hi, Farron. Bridgewater College. Cool. Virginia Department of Wildlife Research. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Great, great, great. Thanks for doing that. All right. Well, I'll tell you a little bit about me. So I am a professor at Virginia Tech. I've been here since 2006. I teach courses at the undergraduate level in environmental communications, basically environmental education and interpretation. At the graduate level, I teach social science research methods and some graduate classes in sustainability as well. My research focuses on collaboration and conflict in natural resource management, as well as environmental communication and education. And I've been involved in this sort of research. I've been involved in projects on every continent. What I'm going to talk about today is some of the key challenges that we face in doing this type of work, and some of the things that my lab and other folks have learned over time. If you get jazzed about any of this, my big idea is to share with you one major theory that we've developed over the years, that we've taken research from a lot of folks and our own, and I'm going to share that with you. And before your eyes glaze over when I say theory, I want to make this point. There's nothing so practical as a good theory. Right? If you've got a really good set of principles, which is what a theory is, we can see ways to apply that to multiple problems. If you do get jazzed about that idea, you see this little book on the screen here. That's a book that has 30 such theories in it, and my grad students call it the Cliff Notes for social scientists who work in natural resources. So if you're interested in this stuff, you can check that out. I think there's copies at the Virginia Tech Library, or there's used copies and all kinds of ways to get that. All right. So the goal is share with you this one powerful theory that I think will be useful to you. And then we'll have some conversation, and we might go into other directions from there. All right. So first, let me ask you a question. I want to challenge you with this idea. First off, anybody know what you're looking at here in this picture? Who has a guess? You can put it in chat. Like, what are these things? You've probably seen them. These are environmental impact statements or environmental assessments. So I spent about 15 years studying NEPA planning processes in federal agencies. And one of the things that there's a number of things we've learned from that research. I'm going to share some of that today. But I want to ask you one question. I'm going to use those NEPA processes as a case study for that. So when you do a process that complies with the National Environmental Policy Act, like many of you are probably aware of, it requires a federal agency, before they do anything on the ground, to come up with some alternatives for solving a problem and to assess the environmental and social impacts of those alternatives. And one of the things they do is they create an interdisciplinary team that has all sorts of ologists in it and others to do that work, right? That result in these big documents, and there's public involvement included in all kinds of challenges. So here's a question. Imagine you're on one of those teams. You've got to do all this work. Or if you're a student, those of you from Bridgewater College, imagine you have a group project, okay, in your class. What's the most efficient way to get the work done? So I'm going to ask you to share your ideas in a poll here. I'm going to give you a couple different work styles. One is you come together as a team and you divvy it up. All right, wildlife person, you're going to do this. Engineer, you're going to do this. Recreation person, you're going to do this. And we'll meet at the end and we'll assemble it. And just maybe the leader of the team weaves it all together and gets this report done. Another way to do it might be kind of similar to that, where you do the same, but you have regular check-ins. Maybe once a month you come together and just make sure everything's going well. Another might be that the leader is the person that constantly is checking in with everybody to make sure everybody's doing what they're supposed to do. And let's go all the way to the far side of the spectrum, where maybe your team works in such a way that anytime you're working on this particular project, you try as best you can to all be in the same room. And when you're in the same room working on it, you're kind of arguing with each other, right? The engineer is asking the recreation specialist questions, and the wildlife biologist is asking the economist questions about their section. And you're kind of having some conflict over the work, right? What do you think's the most, first off, what's the best way? If you want a great project, what do you think yields the best document, the best environmental impact assessment, the one that's going to solve the issue on the ground, the one that's going to withstand public scrutiny? So put some ideas. Do you think it's kind of the divide and conquer with some check-ins, or not? We're in the same room when we do this and we're debating each other and asking each other questions as we go. So let's see what your ideas are in the chat. Okay. Divide and conquer with check-ins is the first guess. Come on, don't be shy. Throw some ideas up here. What do you think? The full-on collaborative in the same room, divide and conquer with check-ins, divide and conquer, or literally everyone does their own thing and you put it together? All right, Farron leans toward together, all together. Okay. You can keep those ideas coming. Now, let me ask it a different way. What do you think is the most efficient way to do it? If you just want to get through this process as fast and cleanly as you can, is it still the same answer? Is it divide and conquer, or is it this more all-together thing? Those are the things I'm seeing here. So divide and conquer with check-ins or all together. What's more efficient?
Can I just jump in here and talk, because it's easier than me typing all this in?
Yeah, go ahead. There's not that many of us, so go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, Mark. No, I think so many things are spinning in my head. It's trade-offs. Yeah, you could go faster, but then are you going to have a document that folks aren't going to really buy into? But man, you always want to do the together thing, but do we have the time and the budget to do the together thing? So
totally, Farron. Yeah, these are trade-offs, and it's the same on a group project and in class, right? If you're a bunch of students, really, are you all going to get together when you're working on this stuff? Okay, so we did a study of nearly 500 NEPA processes. These are the processes that lead to these outcomes in the Forest Service. And what we found was we asked team leaders and team members about their work styles, and those were the options we gave them. And what we found was we were trying to link up a number of variables. One of them was work styles with outcomes. So the outcomes that we were measuring were, well, did you actually manage to implement the project, or was it stopped in some way? Did you avoid litigation and appeals? Did you survive litigation and appeals? And what was the public response? Was the public generally satisfied or not? And what we found was, not only was that collaborative process where they were generally in the same room working whenever they were making one of these massive documents more effective for all those outcomes, but we measured one other outcome, and that outcome was efficiency. And that was asked, compared to other projects you've worked on, how efficient was this one? We had the actual time it took, and we had their subjective opinions about how efficient it was. And we found that the collaborative work style was actually more efficient, in addition to being to leading to these other better outcomes, which surprised us a little bit, right? Because, hey, if I want to be efficient, I like to divvy it up and just get it done and send it through. But it's exactly what Farron was saying. It's look, if we're working together, we're able to ask each other hard questions, right? We're able to see problems in pieces and solve them together. We can draw upon the diverse talents of the group, and we can get the work done a lot better, such that when we get to the end, we have a better document and it's not going to get litigated or appealed or hung up in negative public response. Okay, so we also measured the nature of conflict on the teams. All right, so there's unproductive conflict, which is literally, wow, personal attacks, I can't stand that person. But then there's productive conflict, right? Where we're standing shoulder to shoulder, really looking at the work and asking each other lots of questions and challenging each other's work. Okay, that's what was really leading to better outcomes. Oops, sorry, that was accidental. So take a moment and just think about what it takes to create an environment like that. Of course, it needs time and resources. But there's also some magic ingredients here about how to get people to work together in that productive conflict way, as opposed to unproductive conflict. I'm going to tell you that it's the same key ingredient that's emerged in all of my studies around the world. So around national forests in the US, parks and other landscapes around the world, what does it take to get dozens of conflicted stakeholders to try and work together? What does it take in a Balinese village to get villagers to work with new technologies to protect their lands from rapid tourism development? What actually predicts people's behavior around national parks? Whether they donate and support volunteer park, or whether they vandalize, light fires, harvest timber, take park guards hostage. You're looking at a picture from southern Ecuador here. My doctoral work many years ago was around 3 different national parks, one in southern Ecuador, one in the Caribbean. Yes, I did get to spend time here. It was pretty awesome. And also in the Smokies. And across all of those super disparate places, in 14 months of field work, I was actually looking at what actually predicted people's behavior. So I had to stay in these places to actually see their behavior, right? One variable that I measured amongst many, predicted with over 80% accuracy, within a sample of over 400 people, who is actively opposing one of these parks. That is doing things you don't want them to do, illegal harvest, vandalism, what have you, bringing lawsuits, public protests, etc. And it trumped other things like economic benefits, recreational benefits, other disadvantages of having a park, economic concerns, all of that. And that variable was a pretty simple one that I measured in that study. It was whether how people answered this question. Do you trust the park managers to be fair and honest with the people that live around here? When you put that in a regression equation with anything else I measured, environmental values, all sorts of things, wealth, education, it knocked them all out pretty much. So this should ring true for a lot of folks on this call if you've worked in this field at all. Like, this is an important variable, right? Like, if we want to be able to work together, if we want to get publics to not be really angry at us, building trust can be a really effective thing. All right, so since there's only 15 of us, I'm going to ask, just unmute yourself to answer this question. How do you define trust? Who wants to give it a shot? Like, what's a definition of trust? We all have some sense of what it means. Somebody's got to be brave enough. Oh, go ahead, Farron.
Feel safe.
Okay, it's a feeling of safety. Okay, that's cool. And let's get one more person to chime in and give us your definition of trust.
To have dependency on somebody.
To depend on somebody. Oh, cool. So that's almost like behavioral, right? Like, if I'm trusting, I'm actually depending. Cool. Well, I'm going to give you the nerdy academic definition of trust. This is what some people do define it as a behavior. Most scholars define it as a psychological state. And it's the psychological state in which we are willing to accept vulnerability in the face of uncertainty. Okay. Oh, cool. So I'm seeing some other things come up in the chat. Great. Willingness to accept vulnerability in the face of uncertainty. So this means that, like, there's some risk involved. Whenever there's a relationship, there usually is, because there's usually some uncertainty. And we have to sort of make a leap of faith, right? So in our work, our research has demonstrated there's at least 4 types of trust. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you this story, but let's see if you can kind of hit on some of these before I share what they are. Think about this question. Why do you trust somebody or not? Think about all the groups you've been a part of. Like, why do you trust or distrust others? Let's get, if somebody wants to share, or you can put it in the chat or speak, like, what are some of the reasons why you might trust someone? or distrust them? How do you make that assessment?
It's just experience how many times I've like worked with someone or interacted with them or
Okay, and what about that interaction? Is it that they're good at what they do, or is it something else?
I think you just kind of like chip away at that trust, like a little bit at a time. Like, oh, that meeting wasn't a disaster. Oh, they followed through on that action item. Or, just little things like that. You begin to be like, oh, when you task them with something, it's going to get done. Or you don't have to worry about, showing up to a meeting and having no idea what the meeting is about because somebody, did an agenda or something. I don't know.
Awesome. So your answer is aligning with what most folks are putting in the chat. That has to do a lot with competence, right? And consistent performance in the past. And that's pretty cool. Almost always when I ask this question in North America and in Western Europe, this is the answer I get. Most of us trust based on confidence. But let me ask you, think about it in different situations. So maybe you need to trust somebody to write the introduction to a report. Or maybe you need to trust somebody to give your niece or daughter a ride home from a party. Do you trust, is it the same basis on which you trust? Maybe, maybe not. All right, so as you think about that, I'm going to share with you these 4 different ways in which trust can develop. The first one is inherent within your own personal makeup and history. 2 are interpersonal, and the last is based primarily on context. So I developed this years ago with primarily with a doctoral student of mine named Kim Coleman. So I just want to give some credit there. There's been a lot of work over the years, and we've been using this framework for the last, almost 8 years now in a lot of research in a lot of places, and it seems to ring true. Okay, so let's get on to the theory. The first type of trust we call dispositional trust, okay? So let me just ask you, you can do a show of hands with the little icon. How many of you, when you meet somebody, you're generally a trusting person, your trust is theirs to lose, unless they do something, you're going to trust them. Give me a little show of hands with the little icon things. Okay, we would say you have high dispositional trust. How many of you, when you meet somebody, they've got to earn your trust? You don't give it easily. All right, you can raise your hand if you fall into that. Okay, we would say you have low dispositional trust. Okay, when we're thinking about theory and how to use it, there's not much we can do as communicators or as managers dealing with different publics or stakeholders about this one, except to recognize that what the baseline is of the folks that we're working with. So oftentimes we're in a group like this and we're all kind of on the same side of things. Dispositional trust might be quite high. However, at a public meeting, do you think the baseline is typically a high degree of dispositional trust or low? It's low, right? Why would people show up if they completely trusted us to do the work, right? Unless they were just keenly interested and had a lot of free time. Usually they're there because of some skepticism. So it tells us that it's our job to build trust, right? We can't assume it in these situations. So this form of trust, it has to do with your personal history, your family background, traumas that have happened to you in your life. So again, as a communicator, there's not a whole lot we can do about it except to understand the baseline. And I would say, so trust we've already defined. Distrust is a little bit different from a lack of trust. So a lack of trust is we don't have enough information to make a really clear assessment. We don't really know whether we trust somebody. Distrust means, well, no, I actively expect harm from this relationship. So you can think about that, where are you starting from? And we can talk about distrust repair later as well as we move on. Okay, so not much you could do about that form of trust. The next 3 forms of trust, though, you as a communicator, as a manager of a process, can have a huge impact on. So we're going to call these the actionable forms of trust. The first one falls in with the definitions you gave me, or the reasons you gave me for trusting somebody when I asked. So rational trust is based on our predictions of how somebody's going to behave. And if we can predict with confidence how someone will behave and that behavior is going to benefit us, we're likely to trust them, right? So this is a calculation, right? I know Scott, he's a good performer in the past. He's always followed through. So therefore, I expect him to do something, and that's great. It's going to benefit me. I trust him. So this has to do with consistent performance. It has to do with keeping promises. It has to do with being good at what we do, okay? You can also think about rational distrust, right? Let's say every time I see Scott, he punches me in the gut, right? I would rationally distrust Scott at that point. So It works in both directions, but the idea is this is calculus based. So when we think about this, like I said, most Western folks, like in North America, Western Europe, this is how they'll answer. However, we are also quite emotional beings. In fact, there's a lot of research out there that suggests that we very rarely act completely rationally. There's been some really compelling research over the last few decades that suggests most of our actions are based on our emotions or intuitions, and then we post hoc rationalize them. So even when we think we're being rational, not always. So the next type of trust is based on emotion. We call this affinitive trust, and it has to do with developing an affinity for the person you may be placing your trust in, or the organization you may be placing your trust in. So this has to do with an assumption of similarity. Okay, it may have to do with shared positive experiences. It may be a knee-jerk reaction, right? Like if you meet somebody and they remind you of your best friend from childhood, you're probably going to lean in and have some unexplained emotional trust for that person. If you meet somebody and they remind you of your least favorite politician, it's going to go the other direction, right? But we can still build this over time. So sometimes it does have to do with implicit biases, right? So we need to be active if we want to, if we're immediately feeling that as somebody, as a trustor, not a trustee, they play into this, right? But if we're the person and we're trying to generate trust here, there's a lot we can do, right? So we can be active listeners, right? We can be responsive. We can demonstrate that we care. We can create situations where there can be positive social interactions, where we can expose similarities or shared values. And when I say values here, this isn't necessarily like in a public involvement that we want the same thing to happen. It's more our ideas about what's right and wrong, right? Deeper seated values. So, if you grew up in my hometown, I might make some assumptions about that. And that's why affinitive trust might be a little bit higher to start. So I put this quote up here from Stephen Covey because I love it. And it really demonstrates how we might start to think about building this type of trust. So he says, most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. So just think about how often you're guilty of that first thing, right? Just shifting that of the second thing. It's just shifting to that first thing can really make a big difference, right? So I can tell lots of stories about this. I think I'll share one. The research I did around Virgin Islands National Park, that cool Caribbean site where I shared a nice picture. It was a very conflicted relationship between the park and the people that lived in that place. So people were commonly extracting resources. There were huge, there were some lawsuits going on, lots of vandalism. Park meetings were very heated. Actually, people would throw things sometimes at those meetings. And the history was such that people thought that, yeah, it's always been this way. Or maybe it hadn't, because I asked everyone who had been around, hey, was there ever a time when the relationship was any different between the park and the people that live here? And a lot of the younger folks didn't know. Think about, so little history about that island. It's a US territory, so it's not a state. So having the park there take up 2/3 of that island, it feels very colonial, right? Like, okay, the mainland US is here and we don't have access to our lands. So you can imagine why there's conflict, right? But older folks, when I asked that question, they all pointed to the same exact time period. And it's kind of around 1980-ish. And consistently, pretty much everyone who was alive at that time said, yeah, there was this stretch, like in the early 80s where things were totally different, late 70s. So I went and I tried to follow that up. I went and talked to old park employees. I went and talked to all the old timers on the islands, like, hey, what was different about that time? And what I found out was this: there was a superintendent of a national park that matched that period exactly. And his strategy was a little different than every other superintendent. One thing he always did is every day he would walk through the streets of the main little village, or I guess you can call it a town, and just say hello and kind of gab with folks. He'd also host a monthly party at his house where he just like invite a bunch of people to a barbecue. And probably the most important thing he did is anytime he had a difficult decision to make, he'd go down and hang out with the locally hired maintenance guys in the garage who were hired by the Park Service. That typically those are the only folks hired by national parks locally, are like maintenance folks. And he'd spend the whole day talking it out with them. And what people told me is they seemed to be more in the know of what was going on during that time. And he was a lot more sensitive to locals. So when he left, the next hire was like a local guy who had like gone away to school and came back. You'd think it would be great, but it reverted right away to this conflicted relationships. So what he was doing is demonstrating all the stuff that you see on this page. And there's tons of examples of this. Okay, so we have these two types of trust. Rational, which is calculus-based. I'm predicting how you'll behave and whether that benefits me. So if I want to convince you that I'm rationally trustworthy, I'm going to tell you how good I am at things and that my actions are going to benefit you. Think of how often that's the only way we communicate. Whereas this type of trust is more about, hey, like, we have some similarities and I have your best interest in mind. I really want to hear from you. Let's do this together. Very different tack for a lot of wildlife managers, a lot of park managers. I remember when I shared some of these results with park superintendents, someone's like, wait a minute, you mean I have to be nice too? It's like, yeah, if you actually want to manage your park with less conflict, yeah, that should be part of the job description. You should be a nice person. Okay, so these are these two types of interpersonal trust. The first one was dispositions, two interpersonal types. The last one is about the system in which we interact. So it's not trust in an individual, but it's trust in that system. Can we create a set of procedures or rules for our interactions that protect us, that lower the risk of our interaction? Therefore, like, even if I don't have trust for the other individuals, I only have to trust that they're going to follow the rules in the way that I do. And then we can interact. What we find is when we have these systems that are trustworthy, the other interpersonal forms of trust develop much more easily. And I'll talk about a little ordering of this in a minute, but what are these systems? What are the characteristics? What do they typically look like? Well, often, if we actually can work with all the folks, let's say we're doing a big public meeting with lots of stakeholders, if we can agree on the procedures for how we're going to make decisions, how we're going to talk to each other, what the processes are going to be, people can buy into those processes much better. Okay, and I'll share some examples in just a sec. Transparency just means it's open information sharing, right? So everyone knows what those rules are, and we also know what the consequences might be for breaking those rules. Okay, so I've done a lot of work with the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. This is a massive program in the National Forest Service where basically they're managing hundreds of thousands of acres at a time in response to catastrophic wildfires, right? Wildfires don't stay within forest boundaries. So we've got lots of jurisdictions, Forest Service, tribes, industry, private landowners. Then we also have all the special interest groups. So we've got the timber industry, we've got lots of different forms of recreationists, from wilderness to off-highway vehicles, you name it, they're involved. And we've done studies on these groups all across the US. There's 23 of them. And I'll just share a couple anecdotes. So there's one group that was probably the single most conflicted group when this all began. So there's a big infusion of money. So the money brought people to the table to apply. And the ones who got it created these big collaborative groups that were made up of prior conflicting stakeholders to try and do something on the landscape. So this one group was probably the most conflicted of them at the beginning. They hired an external facilitator and they spent the entire first year basically writing a charter, coming up with what the rules were going to be for what does it take to be a member of this group? What rules do we have to follow? How are we going to make decisions? What happens when we disagree? All right, so there's lots of cool things you can do all along the way. If you come to the end of negotiations and you still disagree, what this group decided to do was, well, when we submit our recommendations to whatever managing authority there is on that particular piece of land, we can also submit a minority report so everybody's voices are equally heard. What happens when rules are broken? So the facilitator would remind people like, hey, remember we agreed on this, you just broke one of the rules. So maybe the first step is a reminder, the second step might be some sort of penalty. And eventually, if people refuse to follow the rules that everyone agreed on and made, they're kicked out of the group and they lose their power in decision-making. Within a couple years, this group was doing amazing things they could never do before. Like stuff was happening on this landscape. It was pretty incredible. Let me contrast that with another group where there was pretty low conflict to start, actually. There were some disagreements in this area, but everyone kind of knew each other and they had agreement on what they called about 80% of the topics they thought they would work on. So they didn't spend that time at the beginning creating specific rules. They just went for it and started doing stuff. What actually happened with this group is a conflict emerged on a nearby piece of land, not even within the acres they were working on, but somewhere else. And because they didn't have any systems in place, when people got angry with each other, it bled right into this group and the entire thing collapsed, right? They were mad at each other. And it took about 2 years for them to get up and running. They eventually had to hire a facilitator to help them start over and create a process by which they could disagree. So fascinating, like, and think this translates to all scales. So imagine you're just doing a small group project, either in your organization or if you're a student in your class. I actually have my students think this through ahead of time. They have to build a system that's going to feel safe for everybody to work in. And there's consequences for like not getting your work done on time. And everyone agrees up front. Therefore, you can't get mad and personally attack each other later. It's just like, oh, well, that's the first consequence. Maybe we talk to the professor. Second consequence is this, third is that. I have these 2 bullets in the middle here: interest, not positions, and shared criteria for evaluating decisions. I want to share these because they're pretty cool and they actually come out of the Harvard Negotiation Project. Some of you are probably familiar with this book, Getting to Yes. So the Harvard Negotiation Project's made of these world famous negotiators who are involved in like negotiating peace in the Middle East and other places all around the world. And they came up with a handful of principles for how to really do negotiations well. The first thing they say is separate people from the problem. I don't like that language. Basically what they're saying is don't attack the person, try and attack the problem, right? Together. And one of the ways they say to do that is to separate your interests from your positions. So position is what you're arguing for. So imagine you've got a wildlife management area and there's a debate about whether to put a new road through it. Okay. Positions might be people who advocate for the road or who advocate against it, right? Road, no road. Those are the positions. The interests are why those groups hold those positions. So once you get to interests underneath by saying, well, why do you feel that way? Road advocates might say, well, we want access to certain spaces there for maybe for recreation, maybe for hunting. Maybe we want a road because we think it's going to bring more tourism dollars, and that'll be great for the local economy. On the other side, people might be concerned with habitat quality, or they might be concerned with the wilderness character of the area or the chance for solitude within the area, right? So imagine I just laid out 5 interests underlying positions. So imagine if your process was this. Well, the first thing we do is get interest and we put them up on the wall. So we're over here looking at our 5 interests. We're going to call those criteria for decision making. Anytime we're considering a pathway for what we should do on this land, we're going to weigh it against the 5 things we all agreed were important. It's a lot easier to get to agree on stuff like that and to come up with creative solutions. You can see overlap than it is to just argue road or no road, right? So that's what shared criteria for evaluating decisions means. So all of these elements can help us create safer systems, right? If we know what's expected of us, we know the rules for engagement, we know how decisions will be made, whether our voice is going to be heard. And what we find is there tends to be a sequence in, at least in collaborative natural resource management, to how these things emerge. In most of the cases we've looked at, especially in the Collaborative Forest Landscape Program, what we found was these initiatives tend to start with a single affinitive trust tie between 2 people who are sick of the conflict. Somebody reaches across the aisle and says, oh my God, this is just terrible. Why don't we go get a coffee or a beer? And if those people can agree to start doing something together, they can bring in each of their coalitions. And then the very next most important thing is this: creating a system through which everyone feels heard and everybody feels safe, and they're allowed to disagree with each other in a safe way. What we find is when that happens, all kinds of cool stuff happens. People start to build relationships as they recognize things about each other. Usually a question comes up, what about crazy intransigent people who just want to put a wrench in the process no matter what? What we've seen in a lot of cases is those people who refuse to play, like if there's 40 people all working together and we've agreed on these rules and there's 2 who are complete outliers, they end up getting marginalized in the group, right? Because everyone's agreeing to do this, and those who are on the edges aren't. Their voices tend to diminish, which is actually kind of fascinating. Okay, so let me summarize. Actionable trust. Well, that's where I have here they are. All right, these are the things that we can actually influence. We're all probably really good at our work. So consistency and follow through and demonstrating our competence is important. When we're trying to convene other people, can we give people opportunities to demonstrate their own competence, like small demonstrations of competence? That can help in a multi-stakeholder setting. Affinitive trust, right? This is, can we set ourselves up to like each other? right? And to be likable. How do we do that? Can we expose similarities? Can we share positive experiences? Even when we disagree with somebody, can we ask about why they hold that opinion? Try to understand it such that we can express some merit in what it is they're saying. Like, hey, I disagree with you, but I see where you're coming from. That helps us get to the underlying interest where we can get somewhere as opposed to the position. And can we just be nice, right? Okay, and I just talked about systems-based trust. Okay, so here's the punchline. We've been doing research with this since we developed it back in 2014. And it was research that was developed on not only our own, but also in the business field and organizational theory. And I think this work has been cited now like close to like 500 times. So there's lots of folks using this. And it's all kind of corroborating this theory that we have. Basically, we call it trust ecology. And the reason we call it that is that in an ecosystem, diversity confers resilience normally, right? So you've got a nice diverse ecosystem, let's say a beautiful meadow or something like that. A massive storm comes in and it wipes out one pollinator. Well, if there's other pollinators in the system, they can fill the niche while the ecosystem recovers, right? We've seen trust work sort of similarly. So what our research is telling us is that any group of diverse stakeholders can succeed in the short term with any one form of trust. You've probably all experienced this, right? Like there was this beautiful charismatic leader, and no matter what she said, we would follow her because we just loved her so much. Okay, that would just be affinitive trust. What happens when she gets promoted and moves to Alaska? The system can crash, right? So what we're finding is that different types of trust, rational, affinitive, and systems-based, can buffer each other, just like diversity can buffer ecosystem resilience. So this is pretty easy to understand in like in a two-person relationship. So let's say we take Scott again. We're working together. Scott said he was going to do something and he didn't. He just dropped the ball. Well, if we have affinitive trust for each other, in other words, if we really like each other, we're going to survive that, right? We can rely on that form of trust while our rational trust, which has just been questioned, recovers. Right? So if you scale that up to a group level, what we're finding is more diversity and abundance of these forms of trust within a network tends to confer resilience to the network. So imagine we have some interpersonal conflicts. Well, we can work together if the system has really good procedures that keep us safe. Okay. If that affinitive leader, if that leader that we all loved who was super charismatic left, well, if we're all pretty good at the work, if we have affinitive trust ties between each other, and if there's good procedures and policies to manage the turnover, we're going to be just fine. Right? So hopefully this makes some sense. So what I want to share with you, and then we'll just have conversation, is a simple worksheet that I've used with groups in a lot of different places. And it's super simple, right? It's just, okay, there's these 4 types of trust. We know they're all important. And what we've seen in our research is if any one of these is lacking, the interaction of a network or a group of people becomes weakened and vulnerable to disturbance. What's pretty cool about this is worked on this in Africa, Asia, US, Europe, South America. These constructs on the left here, dispositional, rational, affinitive, and systems-based trust, they hold, the principles hold across cultures. They matter pretty much everywhere. What differs is how you build them in different settings. So we use a simple worksheet like this, like, I'll work with, let's say that picture from Bali, and I've been working with groups over there who are trying to work with rice farmers to just protect their lands. And as soon as we gave them a worksheet like this, they're like, oh my God, we've been focused entirely on rational trust, telling people how it's going to benefit them, how good we are at our work, demonstrating the economics of it. And wow, we really haven't worked on affinitive or systems-based trust at all. How can we do that? And immediately they're brainstorming ideas because they know the culture in which they work. So what we find is just having a simple tool like this and a simple theory that with just nice clean categories that are actionable can really help us do better work. So that's the big idea I wanted to share. And I'll put an attachment up in the chat if you want this worksheet. But I think I've been talking for 40 minutes and I intended to talk a little less. And we can go in pretty much any direction you'd like from here. but I figured I'd stop and we can have a conversation about any of this. So I will open the floor to anyone who'd like to chat. I'm going to stop the share. And I said I'd put that in the chat, so I'll do that right now.
Shocker that I'm the one that jumps in first.
Ah,
That was great. I'm so glad I chimed in for a lunch presentation. This really dovetails nicely and not surprisingly with a presentation that Kai Andor recently gave us. I work with her within the Fish and Wildlife Service, and we were talking about trust ecology within the context of partnerships and collaborations. So this was a nice kind of extended dovetail to that conversation, and it was great to have some practical examples of some things to think through. And yeah, I've started on one of those threads of trust, but need to build on the others. And so this is, yeah, certainly an opportunity to think about what are the other ways I can work on that.
cool. Thanks, Farron. I'd love for anyone to challenge this or give a situation where you're like, yeah, that sounds great, but in my situation, I don't think it is going to work. Let's talk it out. Let's see if we can troubleshoot or brainstorm at least with the specific situations you're dealing with.
Well, I have maybe while folks are thinking of that, Mark, I wonder if you could think in your experiences, have you seen situations where, you know, where a team trying to adopt this affinitive sort of trust approach and take this time gets top-down pressure to not do that because it seems different? It seems like it might take more time. Like, is there pressure to not be doing, you know, like that sort of work? Is that changing now? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Gosh, yeah. I mean, that's a really great question. I think I've seen it in a lot of different ways. I think I work a lot with federal agencies, and particularly the Forest Service and the Park Service, and they're so hierarchical, right? There's all these like little organizations within organizations within organizations. So much relies on that manager, right? So a lot of times what I try and do is target this research toward that manager level to bring it to bear. So we actually do some research on what motivates folks to work their best. And maybe this would be interesting to share here. And if managers can come to realize this, they get to start to see that like, oh, yeah, this does make sense, right? So we know from lots of research in lots of fields that people who are intrinsically motivated and feel good in their jobs do better work, right? That should ring true to everybody. Easy to understand that. But there's this really cool research out there that suggests, well, how do you get people to feel intrinsically motivated at work? So we draw on two theories. Well, I probably have slides, but it would take me a minute to bring them up. One is called self-determination theory. And it suggests that if you can create 3 feelings in your employees, if there's any intrinsic motivation there to begin with, it's going to bring it up to the 4. Okay. Those feelings are feelings of autonomy, that is freedom to do what you want to do and solve problems on your own. Competence, so adequate training, time, and resources, and positive feedback, so people feel competent in their work. And last is, they call it relatedness, but it's basically like a positive work environment where we get along with each other and we're free from like being attacked. Like we don't have to feel paranoid in our work. So we've got those 3 factors, and there's one other factor that comes in it. And actually we pull it in from a different theory, which is, it's kind of a funny theory, but it's cool. It's old. It's called Herzberg's theory of hygiene and motivation. It's also known as the dual factor model. And basically Herzberg says, all right, if you want to motivate workers, there's sort of 2 things you need to think about. And oftentimes we think about hygiene factors rather than motivation factors. And when he says hygiene he's like, hygiene factors are not motivating. However, if they fall below a certain level, they're demotivating. So what that might be is like pay, your workplace conditions. It could also be having too many tasks to do. Like sometimes when we're trying to motivate somebody and they're always doing the same thing, we like give them new tasks, right? Well, that's depends on what the tasks are. That could just be job enlargement rather than job enrichment, right? Whereas motivation has to do with the meaningfulness of the work, right? So can we actually get people to feel like they're achieving something meaningful? That there's a career path for them. And again, positive feedback. So the extra variable we add from there is meaningfulness, right? Can we tell people how their job is helping us achieve a mission, how it's making a difference in the world? So when I target this type of work to managers, I try and talk about it that way because it's very instrumental, right? It's like, okay, if you can create feelings of autonomy, competence, relatedness, and meaningfulness in your staff, you're going to have a way more productive staff. And research shows that over and over and over again. Every time we study it, yeah, it's like, yep, those things, those are the things that do it. So yeah, I think I've seen it all over the map, and there are sort of, you always come up with these like grumpy, I've been here forever and this is the way we do it kind of folks. I think there's lots of ways to hit it with those folks, to be like, hey, look, there's all this research. We have like statistics and p-values behind it too. You can look at it. This approach tends to yield better results. Easier said than done, right? You could bring a nerdy social scientist like me in, and I can show them like regression equations and stuff, but you won't always have that at your fingertips, I guess. I said I would talk a little bit about distrust, like repairing distrust, because a lot of you probably work in situations where like the baseline is, yeah, people hate us, and they might even have good reason for it, right? Like maybe they're completely screwed over decades before you came on the job. The distrust repair literature is a little younger, but it's actually really fascinating. So it suggests, like, if you're in a situation like that, there's 2 tracks you have to follow to repair broken trust. One is called distrust regulation, and the other is called trustworthiness demonstration. Okay, so on the one hand, you're trying to, so for trustworthiness demonstration, you're trying to demonstrate that you're trustworthy, and on the other hand, you're trying to control the situation such that it's unlikely you'll violate trust again. So a good example of this is, it's a little old now, but I still think it's a great example, is when Volkswagen got caught cheating on emissions tests. This was like 6 or 7 years ago now, maybe even longer ago. Anyway, they got totally busted, right? They were cheating on emissions tests. So what did they do? First, they had to prove that they had to demonstrate that they were trustworthy. So the first step is acknowledging that there's been a breach of trust. Now, this is tricky because sometimes there's legal implications of admitting that you did something wrong. There's some scholars who work on that, and it kind of depends on how you say it, right? Like you can come right out and be like, hey, our lawyers tell us we did nothing wrong. However, it feels like something really happened here, and we want to take responsibility for making it right, right? There's always a way you can do it. But anyway, taking some responsibility that, yeah, we recognize there's been a breach of trust here. That's the first step. The next step is to try to repair the problem if you can. So Volkswagen had to go out, recall every vehicle, and fix the problem as fast as they could for free. They did that. But then they also had to regulate future violations or diminish the possibility of future violations. So they had to invite a third-party monitor into all of their factories and say, yeah, we're going to invite in third-party monitoring, and they're going to make sure this never happens again. All right, so they went on those tracks, and honestly, like, they recovered pretty dang well. I mean, some of us probably barely even remember that was an issue, and Volkswagen's doing just fine. In our work, sometimes agreeing to collaborative monitoring is a really powerful thing we can do. Right, so let's say we got a project going on in a wildlife management area or a fish and wildlife reserve, whatever it might be. People are skeptical about what we're doing. Well, can we agree ahead of time on how we're going to monitor the effects of whatever it is we do? And can we do it together? Right? So if I've got stakeholders who don't really trust what we're doing, well, let's set up the monitoring protocol together, and then let's carry it out together. And maybe we can even put in triggers. Hey, we intended for these outcomes, but if we find A, B, or C, we're going to do D, E, or F, or we're going to revisit the project. That does a couple things, right? It creates a system for trust, so the systems-based trust. It also allows us to really work together and get to know each other. Like if we're out in the field monitoring water quality or like species diversity or bird counts or something like that, there's an affinitive possibility. that we get to know each other better. And obviously it's like a rational check on the outcomes of the work. So I think there's these corollaries when you're in this situation of sometimes it's incumbent upon the agency to be a little vulnerable. Right? To just be like, yeah, we have to accept some vulnerability if we expect other people to accept it to us as well. What else do y'all have? Like, what's like the trickiest, most challenging trust problem or people problem that you're grappling with?
I think it was interesting that you brought up the sort of issue of reputation, right? Like, it seems to me that I don't want to speak for everyone here on the call, but there's often situations like based on going into this region to do work or working with that particular organization or something, which is really biased, right? Like it's not reputation. It's a bias masking as like, I have this information that tells me I should be distrustful, but being able to recognize that as a bias and that you may not actually have firsthand information to that and how to dispel that, how to deal, or at least deal with it, recognize it. Is that something you do before you go to these meetings, during the, from day one, from realization?
Yeah,
how's that?
absolutely. I think, I'm sure everyone on this call has been surprised at least once where they hear so-and-so is terrible and difficult. Then you meet them, you're like, what? I don't get it. Like, they're not that bad. I think there's a couple things that can help us, right? We have to check our own biases. Like, that's why I put that bullet of implicit bias there on affinitive trust, and really trying to listen to understand rather than listening to reply, right? First and foremost. And you've probably all met people who are like innately good at it. Like, my wife is one of these people. Like, she works for the town of Blacksburg, and like, she genuinely just wants to understand. Even like the craziest person that comes to a meeting and like screams at town council, she's curious, right? It's like, if you've watched Ted Lasso, there's a dart scene where it's like, you got to be curious, right? Like, I think that's a huge step. So if we can stop assuming the intentions of the others, like, that's the first step. There's also some really interesting work out there on moral foundations. And it might take me a little while to explain this, but it's kind of cool. So there's this group of evolutionary psychologists, and they say that we as human beings have all evolved to share 5 moral foundations. Sometimes they argue 6, but it's 5 that are pretty set. And they said these are all based on just being human, right? We all have them. However, some of us emphasize different ones of these foundations a little differently. And what a moral foundation is on one end of the scale, you've got what we consider to be good or of positive value, and the other side is negative value. So the first one is harm versus care, right? Harm is generally bad, care is generally good, and obviously evolutionarily that makes sense because we want to take care of our young and all that good stuff. The next one is fairness versus cheating. So as we came out of caves, we needed to root out free riders and cheaters, right? So fairness became an issue. And it goes on and on. But what's fascinating about this is research has suggested that the punchline I'll get to faster if I share this now, is that politically liberal people, especially in the United States, typically only communicate with those 2 moral foundations in mind, whereas conservatives use all 5 commonly. So the other ones are loyalty versus betrayal. This is the big time in-group, out-group kind of argument. So arguments about patriotism or what it means to be an American or one of us versus somebody else. I would say extremes of both parties really use that pretty heavily now. Another is authority versus subversion. So this is the idea of the importance of hierarchy in society. And the last is sanctity versus degradation or purity. So the idea that, yeah, even if something's not harming you, it might still be wrong. So you can see this in like use of terms like sacred or religious language. So what's interesting about these, if you're interested, anyone can email me and I'll share with you some information on it, is once you learn to recognize these moral foundations, even in the craziest person who's shouting at you, you can kind of get underneath like, I can see why they're making that argument. Like, they're not completely crazy. They actually have like a moral reason for thinking that. And what I find is as soon as I can identify that, it makes it easier for me to listen. I mean, otherwise it's just too easy to dismiss them. Like, oh, they're just difficult and they're just completely ill-informed and a complete idiot. I don't want to talk to them. But if we search for like the morals behind, like, why might they be making that argument? All of a sudden we can listen a little better. There's another step with that theory that's a little more complicated. I wouldn't recommend this to anybody without lots of practice, is you can learn to communicate in the moral foundations of the other party, right? So if you're conservative, you can learn to communicate better with liberals and the other way around. That's a little harder to do, but there's really cool examples. We do some research on that here, doing communicative framing, using different moral foundations to make our arguments. And we do find that if you make counter-attitudinal arguments, like let's say arguments about climate change to far-right Republicans, if you use the right moral language, they're less likely to want to punch you in the face than if you use traditional liberal language. So I think a lesson in this is just think about some of the language that we use. And if we're using the traditional, like the mainstream sort of slogan language, what that does is it's like waving a flag over your head, right? So it can immediately turn off folks who are part of a different party or a different stakeholder group if we're using that same tired language all the time. So let's say we want to talk about something like really complex, like immigration or something like that. Like if you start out with, we should abolish ICE, like immediately you're just signaling like, oh, I'm on this side of the scale, and people are going to recoil immediately. Or if you just start talking about open borders, like same thing, right? People on the other side are going to be like, oh my God. But if you talk about like, yeah, I'm really interested in talking about immigration and like what we can do about it, like you can actually have the conversation, right? So anyway, I think there's a lot to do with our language and assumptions we make about each other and how our language signals to other people that they should make assumptions about us. We don't have time to go into the depth of all that, but if you're interested in it, I'm more than happy to provide some reading materials so you can learn about it.
Yeah, and that's very timely as we head into the holiday season with mixed conversations over the
Yeah, I always try these out of my father-in-law. It's great. Yeah.
All right. Well, Marc, thanks very much for meeting with us today. I sincerely hope those of you on the call will reach out to Marc directly if you do have questions or some of these materials. I've had the advantage of seeing some of these things previously, and I find it really fascinating and extremely germane to the work that we do, and I'm sure you will as well. Also, you may have noticed we were recording. I think it stopped at an hour, but we'll make those available to other folks. So if you like what you saw, definitely spread the word. Thanks again, Marc, for helping us today with this. And thank you all for attending. We will have one more fall seminar. It's coming up in early December. It's Ashley Peel's going to talk a bit about some of the preliminary findings that we're getting from the recently completed Virginia Breeding Bird Atlas. So I'll send out some information via the listserv on that. And until then, I hope everyone has a safe holiday. If you have some time off next week and travel, please do that safely. And we'll see you all soon.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.